The Persian Gulf has just witnessed something extraordinary, something that fundamentally changes our understanding of military deterrence in the Middle East. What we're seeing unfold is not merely another episode of regional saber rattling, but rather a carefully calculated demonstration that reveals profound shifts in the balance of power. Iran has directly targeted a United States Navy carrier strike group, and the response, or perhaps more accurately, the lack of response, has sent shockwaves through Washington's defense establishment and strategic planning circles. Now, this is absolutely crucial to understand because what happened next defies everything we've been told about American military supremacy and the so-called rules-based international order. The implications here are staggering. We're talking about a direct challenge to US naval dominance in waters America has controlled unchallenged for decades. This isn't hyperbole or sensationalism. This is a watershed moment that historians will study for generations. The question we must ask ourselves is not simply what happened, but why it happened now, and what it tells us about the rapidly evolving geopolitical landscape, where traditional assumptions about power projection no longer hold true. Let me begin by setting the scene properly, because context is absolutely everything when we're discussing an incident of this magnitude. We need to understand that the United States Navy Carrier Strike Group represents the single most powerful conventional military force projection tool in human history. These are not merely ships. They are floating cities of American power, technological superiority, and strategic dominance. When a carrier strike group moves through international waters, it carries with it the implicit message that American interests are paramount, that American will is absolute, and that any challenge to American supremacy will be met with overwhelming force. This has been the unspoken reality of global maritime power for the better part of 8 decades. Now, what makes this particular incident so extraordinary is not simply that Iran targeted a carrier nations have postured and threatened before, but rather the manner in which this targeted occurred and the subsequent American response, which has been, shall we say, remarkably restrained. And this restraint, this calculated decision not to escalate, tells us volumes about where we actually stand in terms of global power dynamics in the year 2025. The Pentagon has spent considerable effort downplaying the incident, describing it in carefully sanitized language as a routine encounter. But those of us who follow these matters closely understand that there is nothing routine about what transpired. Let's examine the specifics as they've emerged from various sources, both official and unofficial, because the devil is very much in the details here. According to multiple reports that have been corroborated across different intelligence channels, Iranian forces conducted a coordinated operation involving anti-ship missiles, drone swarms, and fast attack craft in a demonstration that was clearly designed to show that they possess the capability to engage American naval assets in what the United States has long considered its own operational theater. This wasn't a probe or an accidental encounter. This was a deliberate, well-planned operation intended to send a message. The question is, what message exactly? And more importantly, has that message been received and understood in Washington? The technological aspects of this operation deserve serious attention because they reveal something quite profound about the changing nature of naval warfare. Iran has invested heavily in asymmetric warfare capabilities, specifically designed to counter American carrier strike groups. We're talking about sophisticated anti-ship ballistic missiles, notably the Khalij-Fars, and the more advanced variants that have been developed in recent years. These are not crude weapons. They represent a genuine threat to surface vessels, including carriers. The Iranian military doctrine has evolved significantly over the past 2 decades, moving away from attempting to match American conventional superiority and instead focusing on creating capabilities that exploit vulnerabilities in the American naval architecture. Now, the drone swarms that were reportedly deployed in this incident represent another dimension of this asymmetric approach. Iran has become remarkably proficient in drone technology, both in terms of surveillance drones and weaponized variants. The ability to launch coordinated swarms that can overwhelm defensive systems is not something to be dismissed lightly. American carrier defenses, sophisticated as they are, were designed primarily to counter Cold War-era threats, large anti-ship missiles launched from aircraft or submarines. The saturation attack, using dozens or potentially hundreds of small, relatively inexpensive drones, presents a fundamentally different challenge, one that the current defensive systems may not be optimally configured to handle. What's particularly telling is the location and timing of this incident. The Strait of Hormuz and the broader Persian Gulf region represent one of the most strategically vital waterways in the world. Roughly one-fifth of the world's petroleum passes through this narrow choke point. Iranian control of the northern coastline gives them inherent advantages in any confrontation in these waters. The geography favors the defender, and Iran has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. The timing, coming as it does amid ongoing regional tensions and shifting global alliances, suggests that Iran feels emboldened, that they believe the strategic environment has evolved to a point where such a demonstration can be conducted without triggering the kind of overwhelming American response that would have been virtually guaranteed a decade or two ago. Let's talk about the American response, because this is where things become truly fascinating from an analytical perspective. The official statements from the Pentagon have been remarkably measured, almost subdued. There's been no chest thumping, no promises of retaliation, no carrier repositioning to demonstrate resolve. Instead, we've seen carefully worded statements about maintaining freedom of navigation, about monitoring Iranian activities, about coordination with regional partners. This is diplomatic language, not the language of military confrontation. And we need to ask ourselves why. Why has the most powerful military in human history chosen to essentially downplay an incident that in any previous era would have been treated as an act of war? There are several possible explanations, and I think the reality probably involves a combination of all of them. First, there's the very real question of military capability and risk assessment. The United States military is not invincible, and senior military planners understand this, even if the rhetoric doesn't always reflect that understanding. A carrier strike group in the confined waters of the Persian Gulf is vulnerable in ways that it simply isn't when operating in the open ocean. The concentration of Iranian anti-ship capabilities in this region is formidable. A genuine shooting war could result in significant American casualties and potentially even the loss of a carrier, an outcome so catastrophic in terms of prestige and strategic credibility that it's almost unthinkable. The decision makers in Washington have to weigh whether responding forcefully to this provocation is worth the risk of escalation that could lead to such an outcome. Secondly, we need to consider the broader geopolitical context. The United States is no longer operating in a unipolar world where it can act with complete freedom of action. China is watching every move in the Middle East, calculating how American responses here might predict American responses in the Western Pacific. Russia maintains significant interests in Iran and the broader region. Any major American military operation against Iran would have ripple effects across multiple theaters. The strategic bandwidth of the United States is finite, and there's a growing recognition in Washington that America cannot afford to be simultaneously confronting China, managing tensions with Russia, and engaging in a major conflict with Iran. Priorities have to be established, and increasingly it appears that the Middle East is no longer the priority it once was for American strategic planners. Thirdly, there's the domestic political dimension that we cannot ignore. The American public has grown weary of endless Middle Eastern conflicts. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the interventions in Libya and Syria, the ongoing commitments across the region, these have cost trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives without producing outcomes that most Americans would consider successful. There is virtually no domestic appetite for another major Middle Eastern war, and any administration that led the country into such a conflict would face severe political consequences. This reality constrains decision-making in ways that are often underappreciated by outside observers who focus solely on military capabilities rather than political will. But there's something even deeper at work here, something that goes to the heart of what we're witnessing in terms of global power shifts. The incident with the Iranian targeting of the American carrier is not happening in isolation. It's part of a broader pattern of challenges to American hegemony that we're seeing across multiple domains and regions. We've seen China increasingly assertive in the South China Sea, Russia conducting military operations in its near abroad, regional powers like Turkey and Saudi Arabia acting with greater independence from American preferences. What we're witnessing is the gradual erosion of the unipolar moment that characterized the immediate post-Cold War period. The economic dimensions of this shift cannot be overstated. American economic dominance, which has underpinned American military dominance, is no longer as absolute as it once was. China's economy is now comparable in size to America's when measured by certain metrics. The BRICS nations are actively working to create alternative financial and trading systems that could potentially challenge the dollar-denominated system that has given the United States enormous leverage over global affairs. Iran itself, despite decades of sanctions, has managed to maintain its economy and even develop sophisticated indigenous military capabilities. The ability of the United States to impose its will through economic coercion is diminishing, and this has direct implications for military posture and strategy. We also need to examine the technological dimension with greater nuance. American military technology remains impressive, but the gap between American capabilities and those of peer and near-peer competitors has narrowed considerably. The presumption of overwhelming technological superiority that characterized American military thinking for decades no longer holds true across all domains. In certain areas, particularly in missile technology and drone warfare, adversaries have developed capabilities that pose genuine challenges to American systems. The era when the United States could assume technological dominance in any potential conflict has passed, and this has profound implications for strategic calculations. The intelligence picture surrounding this incident is also worth considering carefully. How much did the United States know about Iranian intentions before this operation occurred? The fact that a carrier strike group was apparently caught in a position where it could be effectively targeted suggests either an intelligence failure or a deliberate decision to proceed despite knowledge of the risks. Neither possibility is particularly comforting from an American strategic perspective. If it was an intelligence failure, it indicates serious gaps in American understanding of Iranian capabilities and intentions. If it was a calculated risk, it suggests that the carrier was considered expendable, or that the political leadership was willing to accept significant risk in order to demonstrate commitment to regional presence. The regional dynamics add yet another layer of complexity to this situation. America's traditional allies in the region, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, are all watching this incident and drawing their own conclusions about American reliability and commitment. If the United States is unwilling or unable to respond decisively to a direct targeting of its premier military asset, what does that signal about American security guarantees more broadly? We're already seeing evidence of regional powers hedging their bets, improving relations with China, engaging in dialogue with Iran despite American objections. The perception of declining American power can become self-fulfilling as allies seek alternative security arrangements. Iran's domestic political situation also factors into this equation. The Iranian leadership faces its own set of pressures and constraints. The regime has weathered protests, economic difficulties, and internal divisions. A successful demonstration against American military power serves important domestic political purposes, rallying nationalist sentiment and bolstering the regime's legitimacy. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which likely planned and executed this operation, has its own institutional interests. in maintaining tension with the United States and demonstrating its indispensability to Iranian national security. Looking at the military tactical aspects more closely, we need to understand that modern naval warfare has evolved in ways that fundamentally challenge the carrier-centric model that has dominated American naval thinking since World War II. Carriers are expensive, require enormous supporting infrastructure, and present what military strategists call a high-value target. The loss of a single carrier would represent not just the destruction of a ship, but the loss of dozens of aircraft and potentially thousands of personnel. This makes decision makers understandably cautious about placing carriers in high-risk environments. The advent of long-range precision strike capabilities, particularly anti-ship ballistic missiles, has created what defense analysts call anti-access/area denial zones, where carriers cannot operate without accepting substantial risk. The Iranian strategy in this incident appears to have been designed specifically to highlight this vulnerability without actually triggering a shooting war. It's a form of strategic communication demonstrating capability and resolve while stopping just short of actual conflict. This is sophisticated strategic thinking, the kind that suggests Iranian military planners have carefully studied American decision-making processes and calculated how to apply pressure without crossing the threshold that would compel a military response. The fact that this calculation appears to have been correct, that the United States has indeed chosen not to escalate, represents a significant strategic success for Iran and a corresponding challenge to American deterrence credibility. We should also consider the implications for future incidents. If Iran can target an American carrier without facing severe consequences, what precedent does this establish? Will other actors, emboldened by this example, feel free to challenge American military assets in their own regions? The concept of deterrence depends fundamentally on credibility, the belief that certain actions will trigger certain responses. If that credibility erodes, the entire architecture of American global military presence comes into question. We may be witnessing an inflection point where the costs and risks of maintaining global military dominance are beginning to outweigh the benefits in the calculations of American strategic planners. The media coverage of this incident has been remarkably sparse given its significance, and this itself tells us something important. In an earlier era, an Iranian attack on an American carrier would have dominated headlines for weeks. The relative silence suggests either official pressure to downplay the incident or a media landscape so fragmented and distracted that even genuinely significant events struggle to maintain attention. Either way, it means that the broader American public remains largely unaware of how dramatically the strategic landscape is shifting. What we're ultimately discussing here is nothing less than the reconfiguration of global power structures that have been in place since the end of the Cold War. The incident with the Iranian targeting of the American carrier is a symptom of this larger transformation, not an isolated event. It reflects changing military capabilities, shifting economic foundations of power, evolving alliance structures, and new forms of strategic competition. The question facing American policymakers is whether to attempt to reverse these trends through more assertive use of military power, or to accept a more multipolar international system and adapt American strategy accordingly. The response to this particular incident suggests that, consciously or not, the second path is being chosen, at least for now. The implications of that choice will reverberate for decades to come, affecting not just the Middle East but the global balance of power in all its dimensions.